Wedding bells rise over stone and mist as Iris Caro, death-shadowed, unbowed, walks the longest aisle of her life. A duke waits like a verdict. Vows hover, fans still, and then a single word, annulment, cuts the air like a blade, felling the bride and igniting a scandal. What truth hides behind that word? What past reaches from the dark to seize the present? Between duty and desire, dignity and ruin, one impossible choice will set a house and two hearts on a collision course with fate. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and answer this. What do you love most about historical romances? The slow burn glances, the grand stakes, or the secret that changes everything? Bath, England, the year of our Lord, 1853. A city veiled in morning mist and propriety, where every footstep echoes upon ancient stone, and every whisper carries the weight of judgment. The bells of St. Aldhelm's tolled with stately solemnity, as if reluctant to announce what society had already decided was a misalliance. The daughter of a ruined gentleman marrying the Duke of Greythorne? It was a curiosity, a scandal in slow motion, and every eye in the church strained to capture each detail, like ink on gossip-hungry parchment. Iris Caro stood just beyond the heavy oak doors, framed by the faint scent of beeswax and lilies. Her gloved hands trembled inside the sleeves of her dove blue gown, the colour chosen carefully, not too bold, not too meek. The silk clung to her with an elegance she had never been able to afford until today, and even now it felt borrowed. Her bodice was adorned only with a mother-of-pearl cameo, the sole heirloom spared from her father's creditors. Her hair, chestnut brown, glossy in the softened light, was pinned in braided coils at the nape of her neck, with a few wisps that refused to submit, curling rebelliously at her temples. Behind her, the doors opened at last, revealing the long aisle and the faces beyond. Curious, disapproving, expectant, she did not falter, her chin lifted with a grace born not of confidence, but of resolve carved from humiliation and silent prayers. Her escort, an aging cousin with too much cologne and too little spine, offered her arm without meeting her eyes. The aisle stretched before her like a battlefield lined with judgment. Parasols lowered, fans fluttered, and the matriarchs of Bath leaned forward with a hunger for spectacle. Among them, Lady Honoria Vale narrowed her eyes, lips curved into the faintest smile, cold, polished, poisonous. And beside her sat Lord Hadrian Vale, cousin to the groom and architect of the deepest wounds yet to come. He was elegant in black, a study in curated charm, his gloved fingers drumming silently against the pew, his expression unreadable, save for the hint of triumph at the corners of his mouth. At the altar stood the groom, Tristan Greythorne, Duke of Greythorne, tall, unyielding, austere in his dark frock coat, with a posture as straight as the laws he had spent years defending. His gaze held no warmth, only the weight of duty, and something else, something veiled. The air between them felt colder than the spring chill seeping through the stone walls. As Iris reached him, she dared to meet his eyes, grey-blue, storm-dark, unreadable. A nod passed between them, no smile, no welcome, only acknowledgement. The vicar's voice rang out, solemn and brittle. Vows were spoken like terms of a contract, not promises of love. When the moment came to declare consent, Iris's voice was steady, though her heart beat like a sparrow trapped in glass. She did not look at the faces in the pews. She looked only at him. Then, as the final prayer was offered, and silence wrapped the chapel in its sacred hush, Tristan leaned toward her, his breath a whisper just above her cheek. "Annulment," he murmured. The word struck her with the weight of betrayal. Her vision blurred, her breath caught. The carved pews and candlelight spun together in a sickening dance. Her knees gave way beneath her, and only the startled hands of the vicar kept her from collapsing entirely. A gasp rose from the congregation, followed by the low murmur of scandal blooming like wildfire in dry grass. She was helped into the vestry in a hush of rustling silk and soft footfalls. The air inside was colder, cleaner, unforgiving. Tristan entered a moment later, removing his gloves with deliberate calm, as if the altar had not just become a battlefield. "You're unwell," he said simply, his voice too measured, too detached. Did you mean it? Iris asked, her voice hoarse with humiliation. Is that what this is? A charade? A marriage in name only until you dispose of me through some legal sleight of hand? No, he answered. You misunderstand. He did not sit. He did not soften. But his eyes, those stormy eyes, held a flicker of tension, of regret perhaps. The word was poorly chosen. It refers not to our union, but to an entail, a legal clause that binds the Greythorn estate to my cousin's bloodline if I fail to meet certain conditions. One of those conditions is marriage, a lawful one. Yours. Iris stared at him, heart still hammering, the word annulment pulsing in her memory like a bruise. Then why say it at all? Why then? Why, there? Because what I intend to do requires your cooperation, and I am not a man who lies at the altar. He hesitated, and for a moment the cracks beneath his composure showed. The law is precise. It will not yield unless both parties act in unison. You are now the Duchess of Greythorn, whether you wish it or not. Whether she wished it. She wanted to scream, to strike him, to demand warmth, protection, understanding. Anything other than this dry, calculated truth. But she said nothing. I will explain more once we are at the house, he added, stepping back. You need rest. No, she said, her voice sharp with sudden steel. What I need is the dignity you just stripped from me in front of half of Somerset. He did not flinch. The dignity you possess is your own, Duchess. No one can take it from you. And with that, he opened the vestry door. The carriage that awaited was not the ducal landau with its polished brass and crimson crests, but a modest closed coach, a vehicle meant to go unnoticed. No cheering crowds, no floral toss from the chapel steps, only the dull clip of hooves and the silent judgment of Bath's narrow windows. Iris sat beside the man who was now her husband, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the chill of the interior seeping through her gloves. Tristan looked out the opposite window, jaw clenched, profile carved in stone. She turned her face away as well, but not before catching her reflection in the glass, eyes shadowed with betrayal, lips pressed tight, a duchess by title, a pawn by design. Outside, the bells had stopped. Inside the carriage, the silence roared. Greythorn House rose from the earth like a stone memory, its slate rooftops darkened by the mist, its windows shuttered as if guarding secrets too old and too wounded to name. The carriage turned through the iron gates with a reluctant groan, its wheels tracing over gravel that had not felt celebration in years. No garlands adorned the entry, no servants waited with lanterns and smiles. The house had not been prepared for a bride. Iris Carrow, now Duchess of Greythorn by law and nothing else, sat with her hands folded neatly atop her lap as the carriage halted before the massive doors. Her gloves, still damp from the vestry's chill, clung to her fingers like a second skin. The silence between her and the Duke had grown so vast that it no longer needed words. It was its own language, one of caution, disappointment, and unresolved questions. A language spoken between strangers, tied together by duty. A footman in livery opened the door with a bow so rigid it bordered on tremor. His grey curls peeked out beneath his hat, and the flicker in his eyes revealed the truth. He had expected someone else, or perhaps no one at all. Tristan stepped down first, offering his hand to Iris out of reflex rather than tenderness. She hesitated for the barest second before placing her gloved fingers in his. There was warmth in his touch, but not invitation. Not yet. The entrance hall of Greythorn House was grand without flourish. High-vaulted ceilings framed by carved beams, walls panelled in polished walnut, and a worn runner that stretched like an unbroken path toward a sweeping staircase. No flowers adorned the tables, no hearth burned, only the faint scent of lavender wax lingered, a trace of some dutiful hand having polished the wood in anticipation, not of joy, but of propriety. The housekeeper appeared then, Mrs. Hartley, a woman in her middle 50s, broad-shouldered and neat in her grey wool gown and white apron. Her face was not unkind, though not openly welcoming. She curtsied with practised precision, her gaze fixed on Iris, not in judgment, but in assessment. "Your Grace," she said. The title struck Iris like a stone to the chest. "Thank you," Iris replied, her voice quiet but composed. A brief silence followed, broken only by the ticking of a long-case clock. Then Tristan spoke. "Mrs. Hartley will show you to your rooms," he said, already retreating into shadow. "We will speak later." With that, he disappeared down a corridor, his footsteps swallowed by carpets and distance. Iris followed Mrs. Hartley up the staircase, every step echoing in her spine. They passed oil portraits of ancestors she did not yet know, their faces stern and pale under layers of dustless varnish. She saw no children, no scenes of laughter, only dukes and countesses, all watching her with unreadable eyes. At the end of the west wing, Mrs. Hartley opened a heavy door to a suite of rooms. They were elegant in a faded, untouched way. Velvet drapes drawn tightly shut, silver brushed to a dim luster, cushions plumped but untouched by warmth. The bed was massive and cold, the coverlet stiff from recent laundering. "Will your grace require a maid?" Mrs. Hartley asked. "No, not tonight," Iris replied. The door shut with a quiet click, leaving her alone with the ghosts of linen and memory. She walked to the window and drew the curtains back. A grey dusk spread over the distant hills, fog rolling down the slopes like regret. Below, in the garden, roses had already been pruned back to stumps. Winter clung to everything. The following morning arrived with a cold sun and the hollow clatter of porcelain. Iris rose early, not out of habit, but necessity. She dressed herself in a tea-rose wool gown, modest and warm, and stepped into the quiet hallways of a house that had forgotten the sound of feminine footsteps. She found her way to the small study assigned to the Duchess, a room with windows that looked out toward the barren hedges and a writing desk polished to a sheen. There, she discovered the household ledgers, bound in leather and laced with the inked hands of past mistresses, but the entries had grown sparse. Receipts poorly sorted, deliveries redundant, and payments made to suppliers who no longer served the house. Iris frowned and dipped her quill. She did not summon servants. She did not call for tea. She worked quietly, lips pursed, sorting waste from necessity, with the eye of a woman who had once stretched every coin in her father's ruined household. She marked excessive coal deliveries, duplicated linens, and overstocked preserves. She cancelled the most wasteful orders with firm but polite notes, and when she heard footsteps in the corridor, she looked up only once. Mrs. Hartley lingering by the door, watching. Their eyes met. The housekeeper said nothing, but she nodded. Later that day, a footman delivered a silver tray of letters tied in pale ribbon. Invitations, notes of acknowledgement, inquiry, and not-so-subtle appraisal. Bath society had turned its eyes toward the new Duchess. Iris opened them one by one, each bearing the familiar perfume of scrutiny. The first came from Lady Winscott, a small supper with no fewer than 30 guests and an addendum suggesting Iris wear something appropriately subdued for the recent transition. Another, from the Marchioness of Trowbridge, asked whether the Duchess would be continuing the Greythorn tradition of charitable patronage, though she notably omitted which charities had been supported. And then came the most artful of them all, a note from Lady Honoria Vale, her pen as sharp as the edge of a blade. "Dearest Iris, how swiftly the winds of fortune turn. Do let me know when you have settled into your new role, and whether you intend to reintroduce music into the drawing-room. It would be a pity to let the pianoforte gather dust. Fondly, Honoria." There was no fondness in the words, only ice beneath silk. That evening, after the sun had dipped below the hills and the household settled into its habitual quiet, a knock sounded on the study door. Tristan entered without waiting for a reply. His coat was removed, his shirt unadorned by cravat, and his hair, though still carefully combed, showed a softness not present during their ceremony. He stood by the hearth, where no fire had been lit, and looked at her across the distance of the room. "You've found the ledgers," he said, more statement than question. "Yes," Iris answered. "They were neglected." He nodded. "Most things have been." She turned toward him, the candlelight catching the shadow beneath her eyes. "You said we would speak." He inclined his head. "Indeed. You deserve clarity." He did not sit. He rarely did, she noticed, always standing, always braced against some invisible current. "My cousin Hadrian," he began, voice low and measured, "intends to fracture the Greythorn inheritance. My father's will was complex, but in his suspicion of sentiment, he built conditions that gave Hadrian an opening. If the current duke is not married, or if his household fails to meet certain standards of stewardship and respectability, the entail may be challenged in chancery." "And so you married me," Iris said, her tone not bitter but steady, "to meet a legal condition. I married you because you were the only woman I could trust not to betray the arrangement." She absorbed the words without flinching. "You know nothing about me." He studied her then, truly looked at her. At the curve of her shoulders, the steadiness of her gaze, the way her hands rested atop the ledger, ink still staining her fingers. "No," he said. "I know you took a broken estate and found the cracks in a single morning. That tells me enough." A long pause bloomed between them, filled only by the soft creak of old wood and the distant ticking of the clock in the hall. "What do you require of me, Your Grace?" she asked. Tristan's jaw tensed at the formality. "That you continue exactly as you have begun, that you take this house in hand, not to impress society but to anchor it. The court will look to evidence of a functioning household, respectable, responsible, visible." "Visible," she echoed. He nodded. "Letters, attendance, modest gatherings, a presence at charity boards and social calls. Your actions must make the Duchess real in the eyes of the community. Only then will our petition hold." She exhaled slowly, not in resistance, but in recognition of the burden placed upon her shoulders. "And what will you be?" He met her eyes. "The man standing beside you when the court delivers its verdict." She did not reply, but she did not look away. That night, as Iris returned to her rooms, she passed the grand staircase once more, and there, in the gilded frame between the sconces, hung the portrait of a young woman in ivory satin, soft smile, light in her eyes, a camellia tucked at her collar. Eliza Greythorn, the late fiancée, the ghost she had not expected to face so soon. Iris paused beneath the portrait, and though no one watched, she curtsied, not out of submission, but out of warning. The candle-lit chandeliers of the Bath assembly rooms cast golden halos over polished parquet floors and velvet-draped balconies, but beneath the warmth of the lighting pulsed a chill far more biting than winter's breath. It was the chill of scrutiny, of carefully concealed disdain, of silk gloves covering sharpened claws. It was Iris's first public appearance as the Duchess of Greythorn. She descended from the carriage with a composure born not of ease, but of necessity. Her tea-rose silk gown flowed like melted pearl in the lamplight, the neckline modest, sleeves flared in the fashionable pagoda style, edged with lace engageantes she had mended herself with near-invisible stitches. A simple cameo graced her throat, and her hair, coiled and pinned in soft braids, refused to be tamed entirely, a single wisp curling along her cheek. The wind caught it, and she did not smooth it away. Tristan offered his arm with the practiced distance of a man fulfilling obligation. Iris accepted it with poise, not warmth. They had not spoken since their meeting in the study 2 evenings prior. Words between them were as rare as laughter in Greythorn House. But silence, she was learning, could say a great deal when shaped by glances and hesitations. Inside the ballroom, eyes turned. They always did. The rustle of satin paused. Conversations dipped. A beat of silence passed, not long, not obvious, but enough for trained society ears to register the Duchess of Greythorn's entrance. And then, like hounds loosed from velvet chains, the ladies of Bath resumed their whispers. Iris walked forward, chin lifted, expression serene. She had been trained once, before the debts, before the shame. Her mother, now years in her grave, had taught her how to walk as though the ground were hers by birthright, even when it trembled beneath her. Lady Honoria Vale approached first. Of course she did. She moved like a blade in pale blue taffeta, her curls glinting under crystal light, her smile wide enough to show teeth. "My dearest Iris," Honoria cooed, taking her hand. "What a vision you are. That colour is nearly duchess-like. A pause, just long enough. Lady Honoria, Iris replied, her voice smooth as cream and twice as rich. How kind of you to speak. I hear your pianoforte has been silent since last season. Honoria blinked. Not enough for the room to notice, but enough for Iris to see. A ripple passed through the group, clustered nearby. Women who had written her off as a placeholder now eyed her with measured interest. The music began again. A quadrille. Pairs formed with the practice choreography of social necessity. Tristan bowed to a matron and joined the set. Iris stood at the edge. No partner, no invitation. Her status was new, fragile, and no gentleman would risk stepping forward until the balance of power had been declared. It was then that a widow approached. She was not fashionable. Her gown was dark, a few years out of date. Her hair pinned with more practicality than vanity, but her eyes were steady and warm. "Your Grace," she said softly, "forgive the intrusion. I wished only to thank you." Iris blinked. "For what?" "The new shawls sent to the almshouse," the woman replied. "They arrived just before the frost turned. My neighbour has not coughed since." The words were simple, unembellished, but they landed deeper than any compliment on her gown or bearing. "I'm glad to hear it," Iris said quietly. The woman curtsied, then returned to her place near the terrace, vanishing into the periphery where most widows lived in society's eyes. But the impact remained. People noticed. Not everyone. No, but enough. A few ladies tilted their heads. A baroness's daughter glanced at her curiously. Even Lady Winscott's lips pressed into a line that was not quite disapproval, and just like that, Iris began to exist not as a curiosity, but as a presence. It did not escape Lord Hadrian Vale. He arrived at her side like a shadow, offering his gloved hand with a courtly bow. "May I?" Iris hesitated, but declining would make a scene, and Hadrian never made scenes. He curated them. She placed her hand in his and followed him to the floor. They moved with practiced elegance. He was a fine dancer, predictably so, each step precise, each turn fluid. But it was his voice, soft, low, carefully measured, that unsettled her most. "You surprised them," he said. "They thought you would fade quietly into the background." "Should I have?" she asked. His smile held no humor. "No. It would be a shame to waste your talents behind closed doors." They twirled past Honoria, whose eyes narrowed slightly, past the Dowager Countess, who'd once refused her father's handshake, past men who watched her now with new calculations forming behind polite expressions. "You play the part well, Hadrian," Iris murmured, gaze steady. "Charming cousin, supportive kin, the loyal watchdog of the Greythorn legacy." "I am loyal," he replied. "To what?" she asked. He didn't answer. When the music ended, he bowed, pressed a kiss just above her gloved hand, nothing indecorous, and disappeared into the crowd. The warmth of his touch lingered, not from affection, but warning. He was marking territory. On the return to Greythorn House that night, the silence between Iris and Tristan was thicker than usual. In the coach, she sat turned toward the window, the moonlight illuminating the curve of her cheek, her lashes casting shadows like delicate fans. "I presume Lady Honoria was gracious," Tristan said suddenly. "She offered compliments," Iris replied, each one with a needle buried in it. His lips lifted faintly. "As expected. She wants me to feel unworthy." Tristan turned toward her, his profile etched in silver light. "And do you?" Iris met his eyes. "No, I do not." A pause. Not uncomfortable, only aware. "She fears you," he said, "as does Hadrian." She tilted her head. "Do you?" "No," he replied. "I don't fear you, Iris, but I did not expect you." The words hung between them, unexpected, vulnerable. She turned back to the window, but her reflection now met his in the glass. They sat like that until the gates reappeared. The following morning, Iris walked the edge of the Abbey Green, her boots damp with dew, the grey stone ruins casting long shadows across the frost-bitten grass. It was silent here, removed from the weight of chandeliers and lace. She knelt by the base of a crumbling arch and touched the earth. Cold, hard, but ready for something. That afternoon, she summoned Mrs. Hartley and the steward. "I want to host a small tea for the widows," she said. "Just here at the house. Nothing grand. Bread, jam, warmth." The steward blinked. "Your Grace." "Next week," she said, "and we'll begin listing the cottages most in need of repair before winter sets in. I'll be visiting them myself." Mrs. Hartley's gaze didn't falter, but something flickered behind it. "Yes, Your Grace. And in spring," Iris continued, fingers brushing the edges of a garden map, "we'll host a harvest fair on the Abbey Green. Music, games, nothing ostentatious, but open to all tenants and their families." Now the steward stared at her. "We haven't done that in over a decade." "Then it's time we do." As the two left, whispers began among the staff. Not disapproval, something quieter. Hope, perhaps. That evening, as Tristan passed her study, he paused. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Iris sat with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, ink smudging her wrist as she bent over a repair inventory. Candlelight haloed her hair. She murmured to herself, counting aloud, lips moving in quiet concentration. He watched her, unseen, for a moment longer, and for the first time since they had wed, something unfamiliar stirred in him. Not duty, not strategy, not burden. Hope, guarded, but real. It was on the first Thursday of October that Iris Carrow, Duchess of Greythorne, set out beyond the fashionable heart of Bath and into the veins of the land she now called her own. The morning broke grey and damp, with a low sky heavy as unspoken words. Mist clung to the hedgerows and softened the outlines of the cottages nestled among the hills. The smell of wood smoke hung in the air, mingling with the earthy perfume of damp leaves and trampled hay. It was not the scent of ballrooms or parlour fires. It was the scent of labour, of survival, of lives lived far from drawing rooms and lace. Iris rode in a modest carriage, her gown a practical wool of ash blue, her cloak lined with fur, more for necessity than elegance. Her gloves were already stained at the fingertips from ink and clay. She had risen early, sorting through lists of tenants and notes from the steward, and now carried with her a ledger bound in worn leather, the corners softened by use. The first stop was the Davies cottage. The roof sagged beneath the weight of years, its thatch frayed and darkened by storms. A child's wooden cart, broken at the wheel, lay half buried in the mud. The door opened before the footman could knock, and Mrs. Davies appeared with a babe on her hip and the weariness of sleepless months in her eyes. Iris stepped down from the carriage without waiting for assistance. "Mrs. Davies," she said gently. "May I?" The woman hesitated, startled, then nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." Inside, the air was close with damp. The hearth smoked even with the flue open, and the stone beneath the windows wept with condensation. Iris knelt by the fire, felt the draught from the loose mortar, and made notes in her ledger. "A mason," she murmured, more to herself than anyone, "and chimney work, possibly a new flue cap." Mrs. Davies looked on, uncertain whether to speak. Iris rose and smiled softly. "I don't believe charity loses value when it is practical," she said. "You need warmth more than words." The woman's eyes welled up, but she only nodded again. The visits continued throughout the morning. In one cottage, a child's cough spoke louder than his mother's apologies. In another, the floor near the hearth dipped precariously, the wood blackened beneath. A broken stile left one tenant's path to town nearly impassable in wet weather. Everywhere she went, Iris made notes, asked questions, and listened, truly listened, with the dignity of one who did not pretend to rescue, but to serve. By the fifth cottage, Tristan had joined her. He arrived on horseback, his coat damp from a light drizzle, his presence a quiet tension at first. Iris looked up from her notes as he dismounted, and their eyes met across a yard slick with mud. "You needn't have come," she said, brushing a leaf from her cloak. "I was told you left before breakfast," he replied. "Alone." Her lips curved faintly. "Not quite. I had my ledger and 3 footmen." He looked around, surveying the cottage, the repairs needed, the state of things. "I thought the Duchess's duties would be limited to teas and petitions," he said. Iris closed the ledger. "And I thought the Duke's concerns were confined to chancery briefs and riding alone in the hills." That earned her the ghost of a smile, small, real. For the remainder of the day, they moved together, a pair carved out of unease, but softened by mutual observation. Tristan spoke sparingly, but when he did, it was with clarity. He pointed out where a new roof beam would need reinforcing, signed off on materials for repairs, and spoke to the steward with quiet authority. By late afternoon, the wind picked up, shaking the trees of their tired leaves. The carriage turned back toward the Greythorn estate, and the air between them, though still stitched with silence, was no longer cold. The following week, the Abbey grounds were prepared for the harvest fair. It was not a grand affair. There were no banners of silk or trumpets sounding through the valley, but there were hay bales arranged in careful semicircles, tables laid with pies and loaves, donated by grateful tenants, and a makeshift canopy stretched between the stone pillars of the old Abbey ruins, under which a fiddler and a flautist began to play. Children ran barefoot through the grass. Women with aprons dusted in flour, gathered with baskets of preserves. Old men leaned on walking sticks and nodded to one another with the solemn pleasure of being remembered. Iris moved among them without fanfare. She wore a gown of plum wool with a modest collar, and her hair braided simply, pinned with a single brass comb. Her smile was easy, but her eyes sharp, watching, noting, memorizing. It was there, beneath the crumbling arches, that Lady Pentlow found her. The dowager moved slowly, her cane clicking against stone, but her eyes were as bright as ever, grey and shrewd beneath a velvet bonnet adorned with black lace. "Your Grace," she said, nodding with approval. "You've done something rare." Iris turned to her, hands clasped gently before her. "And what is that, Lady Pentlow? You've made the gentry nervous without ever raising your voice." Iris allowed herself a smile. "That was not my intention." "No," the dowager said, "but it was your effect." They walked together, slowly, past a young boy tossing apples into a wooden bucket. "Bath society is a living creature," Lady Pentlow said. "It devours the weak and follows the powerful, but it always fears the unpredictable." "I suppose I am that." The dowager stopped, leaning slightly on her cane. "Tristan was not always as you see him now," she said, her voice gentler. "He had laughter in him once, and fire, but grief changes the body as much as the face. Eliza's death was a wound with no dressing." Iris's gaze dropped to the path. "I know her name," she said softly. "She was my goddaughter. Lovely and bright, and not built for this house." Lady Pentlow's eyes fixed on the ruins ahead. "You are, but you must decide what you want from the man who lives inside those walls." That evening, the fair faded with the last notes of the fiddle. The guests departed slowly, reluctant to leave the warmth that had bloomed among them. As the last carriage rolled away and the lanterns were extinguished, Iris returned to the house with wind-kissed cheeks and skirts damp from the grass. She found Tristan in the library. The fire had been lit, its glow softening the harsh lines of the room. He stood near a window, a glass of port in one hand, watching the wind scatter the final leaves from the ash trees. "You did well today," he said, not turning. "It wasn't meant to impress." "I know," he replied. "That's why it did." She crossed to the table where a silver tea service had been laid out. Steam still curled from the pot. She poured herself a cup, then hesitated. She poured one for him, too. He turned then, surprised. She held it out. "Peace offering?" she said. He took it, their fingers grazing for a moment, brief, electric. "Are we at war?" Her lips twitched. "That remains to be seen." They drank in quiet. Not silence, quiet. The difference was in the comfort. Outside, the wind howled against the glass. Inside, warmth held its ground. And in that moment, over tea, over laughter that almost but didn't quite rise, over glances that softened, they ceased to be strangers playing roles. They began, slowly, to become something else. The morning began not with birdsong or frost-kissed light, but with parchment. A folded letter bearing the seal of Vale and Rothsay, solicitors to the Crown, arrived by courier shortly after sunrise, its crimson wax broken not by Tristan, but by Iris, her hands steady, her eyes sharp. She had risen before the fire had taken to the logs, dressed in a gown of slate-blue wool, her hair pinned tightly to chase away the thoughts of dreams that had grown too warm. The contents of the letter were brief, elegant, and cruel. To His Grace, the Duke of Greythorne, we write to inform you that our client, Lord Hadrian Vale, has formally submitted intention to petition the High Court of Chancery for review of the inheritance terms defined in the Greythorne entailment. Based on credible reports that the recent union between yourself and the Duchess was precipitated by financial distress and in absence of long-standing familiarity, Lord Vale seeks review under grounds of misaligned intent and the possible impropriety of marital advantage derived from unverified assets introduced via the Duchess's person. It was signed with ink too fine to smudge and hearts too cold to feel shame. When Tristan entered the drawing-room moments later, freshly dressed and unreadable, he found her standing by the window, the letter in hand, the autumn light painting her silhouette in soft golds and silvers. "They move quickly," he said. "They move with intent," she replied, not turning. He accepted the letter from her fingers without touching them. "They're implying I am a fraud," she said quietly, "that I married you to secure my father's debts through you." Tristan folded the letter without glancing at it again. "They are implying you are a liability, because a woman of means without a dowry is easier to dismantle." The silence that followed was not quiet. It was loud with anger, with pride held tight, with humiliation reined in by iron grace. "I want to see the books," Iris said. "They're being handled," he replied. "I want to see my father's debts," she clarified, each word sharpened by restraint. Every note, every signature, every humiliation. Tristan studied her, his jaw taut. "Iris, don't protect me from it," she said, turning at last. "I've already lived the consequences of his choices. I deserve to face their shape." Their eyes met across the room, and for once, neither looked away. Later that morning, she sat alone at the writing desk in the North Library, surrounded by ledgers, letters, and bank statements, rows of elegant script detailing the slow erosion of the Caro fortune. Here were the debts for gambling, the interest paid too late, the creditors appeased with silver heirlooms and empty promises. Here were the final desperate loans, taken in her name, without her consent. And here, at the margins, she found notations in a different hand, Tristan's, simple, calculated, quietly paid. Several notes bore a checkmark, settled, some bore initials, TRG, and suddenly the weight of her pride, so carefully balanced, threatened to collapse. She did not cry. Iris Caro had not wept since the morning her mother's portrait had been sold to cover a stable hand's wages, but her throat burned with unshed fury, not toward Tristan, but toward the legacy of men who made choices with women's names and never paid the cost. When he found her hours later, she was seated still, but stiffer, as if the quiet had frozen her. "You paid them," she said without looking up. "I did. Why not tell me?" "Because your dignity is not a transaction." Her head lifted at that. "I am not ashamed," he added, approaching slowly, "but I knew you might be." She rose then, slowly, and placed her palm on the open ledger. Her fingers brushed the ink, his ink, and the initials that, without fanfare, had preserved her name. "I won't hide behind you," she said. "I never intended to." "I know." The silence between them softened. "I want to fight," she said. "Properly, openly. If Hadrian wants to make a case of our marriage, let him face the house we've built." Tristan nodded. "Then we must prepare it." And so, over the course of days and nights that blurred the boundaries between strategy and something far more intimate, they worked. They sat across from each other at the library table, surrounded by papers and soft lamplight. Iris compiled letters of thanks from tenants whose roofs had been repaired, whose children had found medicine waiting at the door, whose fires had not gone cold. She transcribed testimonies from labourers paid fairly, from seamstresses hired for winter mending, from widows who now met once a week for bread and tea and the dignity of being seen. Tristan reviewed the ledgers, cross-referencing repairs with estate accounts, ensuring every action taken since their wedding was documented, not as charity, but as governance. There were moments, small, flickering, where glances lingered too long. where her hand brushed his across a shared page and he did not move away, where laughter, uninvited, slipped between them over a spilled inkwell or a missing receipt. But the moment that changed the air between them came one night when the fire had dimmed and the room smelled of wax and wood smoke. They were seated side by side, shoulders not touching but near, the warmth of each other more present in what was not than what was. Iris closed a book and exhaled. "I've thought about that word," she said softly. "The one you whispered at the altar." He was still beside her. "Annulment," she continued, the word tasting different now. He turned his head, meeting her gaze in the amber light. "I said it to protect you. I know," she said. "But in that moment, I believed it was about me, that I was being discarded before I'd even begun." His eyes darkened, not with guilt, but with something deeper, regret. "I did not expect it to wound," he admitted, "but I see now that it did." She nodded. "Because I feared you were right." His brows knit. "I feared I was unworthy," she whispered, "that you saw in me only desperation." "That everyone did." He did not speak. Instead, he reached slowly, carefully, and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the closed ledger. The touch was warm, solid, honest. "You are not unworthy," he said, his voice low. "You are formidable." Her breath caught, not from surprise but from something older, something soft and breaking open. She turned her hand beneath his, letting their palms meet. The ledger forgotten, the silence full. And in that moment, they were not a duke and a duchess navigating scandal, not adversaries bound by a name, not even partners in strategy. They were two souls, bruised and breathing, reaching across the chasm that had once separated them, and finding there in the quiet that the bridge had already begun to build. Autumn had settled with full authority over Bath, cloaking the city in amber light and bitter winds, as if the season itself sensed the undercurrents of tension coiling beneath the polished surfaces of society. The leaves along the Greythorn estate had turned copper and gold, falling in soft spirals across the abbey ruins and clinging to the edges of stone paths worn by centuries of footsteps. But while nature began to shed its ornaments, the drawing rooms of the elite grew ever more adorned. It was within such finery that Lord Hadrian Vale staged his latest performance. The invitation had arrived on cream parchment edged in filigree, the calligraphy as precise and theatrical as the man himself. An intimate gathering, it read, to celebrate the music and spirit of the season. But those who attended knew it was no simple soiree. It was a test, a display of influence, a subtle execution delivered in crystal, satin, and scandal. Iris stood before her mirror as Mrs. partly fastened the final row of buttons along the back of her gown, deep amethyst velvet, fitted at the waist and flaring gently at the hips. The sleeves fell in a perfect bell, lined with plum silk and edged with antique lace. A modest string of pearls graced her neck, and her hair was coiled into a braided crown, the same style worn by the duchesses, painted along the corridors of Greythorn House. Tristan entered the room as she fastened her gloves. His gaze swept over her with a pause too brief to linger, but too deep to dismiss. "You look the part," he said. "I must," she replied. "For both of us." He offered his arm. She took it. They entered Hadrian's townhouse as a united front, Duke and Duchess, composed and elegant. The foyer was ablaze with candlelight, polished wood floors reflecting 100 tiny flames. Music drifted from the drawing room, violins and a pianoforte playing something delicate and deceitfully cheerful. Guests turned at their entrance, and the smiles that greeted them were laced with curiosity, envy, and calculation. Lady Honoria Vale was the first to approach, her gown a pale silk that shimmered like a serpent's skin. "Iris," she murmured with sugar-slick grace, "you truly are a surprise." "Only to those who expected nothing," Iris replied softly. Honoria's lashes fluttered, her smile tightened. "How clever." In the center of the room, Hadrian stood like a conductor without an orchestra, greeting guests, complimenting dresses, guiding attention like a puppeteer. When he spotted Tristan and Iris, his expression lit with something too sharp to be warmth. "Tristan," he said, clasping his cousin's hand, "and Iris. May I say, Duchess, you've adapted remarkably well. One would never guess how recently you— Well, never mind. Come." His voice was velvet, his meaning steel. The evening unfolded as expected. Music, conversation, perfectly timed laughter. Champagne flowed like forgiveness, but beneath it all was the unmistakable tension of an unveiled weapon. And then it came. The moment was almost imperceptible. A guest, a baronet's nephew barely old enough to shave, mentioned in a voice just loud enough to be heard that he had heard something curious, that a gentleman formerly employed at Graythorne House claimed to have knowledge of the Duke's private negotiations prior to his marriage, that perhaps the union had been arranged not out of affection or duty, but for a singular legal purpose, that perhaps, just perhaps, it had been a fiction. The words slithered across the room like oil across silk. No names were named, no accusations made outright, but the implication was clear. The marriage was a sham, engineered to preserve wealth, not to honor vows. Iris heard it all without flinching. She did not rise. She did not protest. Instead, she turned to the baronet's wife beside her and smiled. "Would you permit me to deliver an invitation?" she asked. The woman blinked. "An invitation?" "Yes," Iris said. "We'll be hosting a musicale at Graythorne House next Thursday evening. A modest gathering to benefit the widows and wounded of the West India Regiment. All proceeds will go toward new winter coats and supplies. I do hope you'll attend." The woman's eyes widened, then softened. I should be honored," she murmured. Within minutes, a dozen more guests had received similar invitations. Quiet, personal, without spectacle, but rich in meaning. Charity, not gossip, would carry the narrative now. Tristan watched from across the room, his hand tightening around a glass of brandy he had not touched. He saw the glances Iris received, the calculated flicker of interest, the shifting tide. She had not defended herself with outrage. She had countered with grace. When the carriage returned them to Graythorne House that night, the sky was moonless and the wind sharp with the promise of rain. As they neared the narrow cliff road just beyond the final bend toward the estate, the driver cried out. The coach jerked violently. The horses reared. A thunderous sound tore through the air, stone cracking, tumbling, breaking loose. Then silence. Only inches ahead of them, part of the cliff path had collapsed. Loose stones, jagged and freshly disturbed, tumbled into the ravine below. The edge of the road was fractured, a yawning mouth where solid earth had been only the day before. Tristan flung open the door, helping Iris down with unspoken urgency. The coachman descended, pale and trembling. "It was sound yesterday, Your Grace," he stammered. "I swear it. I ride this path daily. There was no loosened ground." Tristan's face darkened. Someone tampered with it. Iris stood very still, her cloak fluttering in the wind. He turned to her, voice low. "From this moment forward, you will not leave the estate without a guard." She nodded. "And the cliff? I'll station men tonight. I want no one near it until I've spoken with the steward." They walked the remainder of the road in silence, side by side. Their hands never touched, but the space between them was charged, electric. The near accident had not shaken Iris's composure, but something in her expression had changed. Not fear, resolve. That night, unable to sleep, Iris wandered the halls alone. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of clocks and the groan of old beams. The moon had returned, pale and low, casting faint silver light through tall windows. She paused before the grand staircase, and there, halfway up, her gaze fell on the portrait of Eliza Graythorne. She had passed it a dozen times since her arrival, always with polite indifference, but tonight she paused. Eliza was lovely, pale gold gown, camellia at her shoulder, gentle eyes, and a smile painted with restraint. Something about the portrait tugged at Iris, a soft curiosity. On instinct she stepped closer and saw it, a corner of parchment barely visible tucked just behind the frame. She reached carefully, pulling it free with delicate fingers. It was a sketch, charcoal, on ivory paper, a half-finished drawing of the Abbey gardens, a woman's hand, graceful, reaching out to touch a branch of leaves. Beneath it, In a delicate slanted script, 5 words. For Tristan, life insists on blooming. Iris stood very still. The note was not a love letter. It was a memory preserved, a message caught in time. She did not hesitate. She crossed the hall to his study, where a low fire still glowed. He was there, seated, robe draped across his shoulders, a ledger open before him, unread. She said nothing at first. She simply placed the sketch on the desk. His eyes moved to it, his breath caught. Then, slowly, he looked up at her. "Where did you find it?" he asked, voice rougher than usual. "Behind her portrait," she replied. He lifted the paper as though it might disintegrate in his hand. Iris watched him, her voice soft. "You're allowed to remember." He looked at her, and for the first time, his mask faltered. "She was part of your past," she continued. "But I don't believe she would want to haunt your future." He closed his eyes briefly, then nodded once. "You aren't replacing her," she said. "You are surviving her." His hand curled around the edge of the desk, steadying. She turned then, ready to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Iris." She looked back. "Thank you." And though no further words passed between them, something unseen shifted. A fracture healed. A door opened, quietly. And in that lantern-lit study, grief began to make room for something else. The candle flames flickered gently in the greythorn drawing room, throwing halos of golden light against the velvet curtains and gilded cornices. Shadows danced like whispered truths across polished wood and carved mantelpieces as the soft strains of a string quartet filled the air. There were no lavish centerpieces, no crystal chandeliers brought from London. And yet, the atmosphere possessed something rarer than opulence. It had sincerity. The musicale had been Iris's idea, executed not with grandeur, but with care. It was a gathering born of quiet dignity, a benefit for the widows of the West India Regiment, hosted with humility and purpose. The guest list had been carefully chosen, a blend of influential merchants, sympathetic ladies of rank, and a few surprised clergymen who had not expected to be welcomed so graciously into ducal walls. Iris moved through the room with the calm assurance of a woman who knew the weight of both judgment and compassion. She wore a gown of pale lavender silk with a high waist and lace cuffs, understated but elegant, the colour chosen for its softness rather than for spectacle. Her hair was swept up in a braided crown, adorned with a single pearl comb, a token of refinement rather than show. She had invited no performers from London. Instead, the musicians were local, a violinist whose wife managed the tenant school, a flautist from the cathedral choir, a pianist who had once taught children of Greythorn's tenants for coin and bread. Their music was not flawless, but it was felt. Each note seemed to echo not just through the room, but through the very bones of the house, warming its long silent heart. Between the performances, Iris had arranged for testimonials to be read aloud, letters from tenants and widows who had received aid, shelter, and dignity under her quiet administration. The steward read one from a mother of 5, whose hearth had been rebuilt before the first frost. Lady Pentlow herself stood to read another from a widow who now kept hens and earned her own coin. As the letters were read, something began to shift. The air changed. It was no longer just a musicale. It became a declaration. The Duchess of Greythorn, they now whispered, did not host balls or chase fashion, but she repaired roofs. She listened. She acted. By the end of the evening, several guests had approached Iris with offers, not grand donations, but sincere ones: wool for blankets, bread for the widow's table, a printing press for school handbills. Lady Pentlow stood beside Iris as they accepted the offers, her cane in one hand and her expression unmistakably proud. "You've changed the melody of the room," the dowager murmured as the final piece played, "and now they'll be humming your tune for weeks." That same week, the pump room was filled with murmurs of another kind. The ancient columns of Bath's most sacred social sanctuary gleamed in the morning light. Water trickled from the sacred spring, casting steam across the panes as patrons sipped from porcelain cups and recited the latest gossip with the reverence of confession. Iris entered just before 11. She had worn a travelling coat of deep grey, trimmed in burgundy velvet, her bonnet lined with silk to match. Her gloves were simple suede, her posture composed. A half-dozen eyes followed her as she crossed the mosaic floor toward the periphery, where Lady Pentlow and two merchant wives waited by the balustrade. The air was thick with curiosity, eyes narrowed. Fans paused mid-flutter. Lady Honoria Vale watched her from across the room, a half-filled cup of water held like a sceptre between gloved fingers. She approached. "Iris," she said, voice silk over steel, "your musicale? What a charming little gesture. The city is positively abuzz." Iris turned with a nod. "I'm pleased to hear it." The widows were grateful. Honoria smiled, eyes unblinking. "And yet one must wonder how grateful you are to enjoy the spotlight, even if, of course, the light is borrowed." "I don't seek light," Iris replied calmly. "I seek warmth." Honoria's smile thinned. "A noble sentiment, though I suspect warmth will do little in Chancery. Sentiment, after all, does not hold against law. They care for lineage, blood, not charming anecdotes about cracked hearthstones." Iris inhaled slowly, and then, without raising her voice, she said, "A legacy built on fear or falsehood or cruelty is nothing more than ash." And Bath, however reluctant, has begun to recognize the difference. The statement fell between them like a struck bell. The room heard it, clearly. Lady Pentlow sipped her tea, unaffected. One merchant wife exchanged a meaningful glance with another. Honoria's eyes narrowed. She said nothing else. She turned and walked away with the grace of a swan and the soul of a storm. But her poise, once diamond-cut, began to fracture ever so slightly. In the days that followed, invitations that once arrived like clockwork were delayed. A perfumery declined her request for an exclusive scent. The cathedral choir scheduled a performance during her luncheon. And while no doors slammed, some began to ease themselves closed. In the meantime, Greythorn House continued its quiet preparations for Chancery. Tristan's investigator, a man named Orford, with eyes like winter glass, returned that same week with findings. "I traced the disturbance at the cliff trail," he said, standing before the fireplace in Tristan's study. "The stones were shifted deliberately. We found tool marks beneath the earth." "And who?" Tristan asked, already suspecting. Orford hesitated. "A groom, hired under Hadrian's steward. Name given was fictitious. He vanished 2 days after the musicale, left no belongings, no trace." Tristan's hands clenched behind his back. "He meant to injure her," he said. "Or frighten her," Orford replied. "But the message was clear. Strengthen the security along the estate perimeter," Tristan ordered, "and watch Hadrian's movements, discreetly." Orford bowed and disappeared into the shadows. Later that night, Tristan found Iris in the west gallery. She stood by the tall windows, her hands folded, the moonlight casting her in silver. She did not turn when he entered. "I had the investigator's report," he said. "I assumed you would. It was sabotage." She nodded slowly. "I thought it might be." His voice softened. "Are you afraid?" She turned to him at last. Her eyes were not frightened, but tired, steady, wiser. "I've been afraid before," she said. "This is something else." Tristan crossed the space between them slowly. He stopped just before her, close enough that the firelight touched both their faces, but not so near as to presume. "I will not let them break you," he said. She tilted her head. "They won't." He hesitated, then said more quietly, "Nor will I." That night he left her at the door to her chambers with only a look. But in that look was 1,000 unspoken things: respect, admiration, and something softer, growing like firelight in a long-abandoned hearth. By the end of the week, Lady Honoria Vale sent no letters, not because she had nothing to say, but because, for the first time, no one was listening. London was a city of stone and soot, its heartbeat measured in the echo of carriage wheels on wet cobblestones, and the restless murmur of crowds beneath layers of fog and formality. The Court of Chancery stood like a solemn monument in the midst of it, austere and grey, as though it had never known joy or warmth, only rules carved into marble and consequences stitched into silk. Iris had never been there before, And yet, as she stood at the foot of its steps in the pale light of a November morning, she did not falter. Her gloves were black, her travelling gown, deep bottle green, hugged her frame with quiet severity, trimmed in velvet and finished with a high collar that gave her dignity the shape of armour. Her bonnet cast a faint shadow over her eyes, but her gaze was unflinching. Tristan stood beside her, solemn and silent, his dark coat immaculately pressed, cravat tied in a perfect knot. They had not spoken much during the journey from Bath. Words seemed unnecessary now. The truth would speak for them, or it would not. Inside, the court buzzed with hushed expectation. Lawyers shuffled papers, clerks scurried across stone floors with urgency, and the great stained glass window above the magistrate's bench filtered weak daylight into colours too muted to inspire comfort. The case was listed third on the docket. Graythorne Visas. Vale. Petition for restructuring of entailed holdings pursuant to heir protection clause and marital confirmation. The language was cold, but the stakes were not. Tristan and Iris sat side by side at the long mahogany table, their solicitor, Mr. Danvers, an older man with hawk-like features and a voice like gravel soaked in ink, placing before them a neatly organized bundle of parchment tied with navy ribbon. Behind them, in the gallery, Lady Pentlow sat with quiet poise, a lace veil over her hair and a small pearl pin at her throat. Just behind her, two merchant representatives and a vicar from Bath waited in support. Across the aisle, Lord Hadrian Vale arrived with a theatrical slowness that made even his footsteps feel rehearsed. He wore a cravat of ivory silk, a waistcoat embroidered with gold thread, and an expression of amused anticipation. He was not alone. At his right stood a thin man with nervous hands and pale eyes, introduced to the court as Jonathan Fry, a former footman of Graythorne House. The judge entered, robes sweeping behind him like a shadow. The chamber fell silent. Mr. Danvers rose first. He outlined the petition, a legal restructuring of the Graythorne estates to protect them from conditional forfeiture in the event of marital challenge. He explained the circumstances of the current marriage, the documented reforms executed under the Duchess's oversight, and the widespread support within the community. Then, with deliberate reverence, he placed before the court a stack of documents, receipts, testimonies, ledgers, every action taken since the union began. Iris did not shift in her seat. She breathed evenly, her hands resting upon her lap, her expression composed yet luminous. The judge, Lord Erskine, adjusted his spectacles and raised a brow. "Her Grace is to be commended for the detail of her documentation," he said. "It is rare to see such stewardship." A ripple passed through the room. Then Hadrian's barrister rose. He spoke with the polished ease of a man who made a career out of discrediting women without ever saying so directly. "My lord, while we do not contest the Duchess's apparent efforts," he said, "we must address the matter of intent. This marriage was, by our witness's account, never intended as a union of truth. It was orchestrated, perhaps even coerced, to meet the bare legal standard required to protect His Grace's holdings." He turned slightly, offering the court a gesture as if unveiling a masterpiece. "I present Mr. Jonathan Fry, former employee of Graythorne House, who will testify that the marriage was never consummated, that there was an understanding, an arrangement from the beginning, and that the Duchess herself confided in staff her plans to leave once the title was secured." A gasp was heard in the gallery. Iris did not move. The judge motioned for the witness to step forward. Mr. Fry took the stand, his hands twitching, eyes flitting between the barrister and the back of the room. He cleared his throat, stammered. "Her Grace, I mean. She said she wouldn't stay long," he muttered. "Said it during supper in the servants' corridor. That she would fulfill her part and then leave." The barrister nodded encouragingly. "And did His Grace ever visit her chambers?" "No, sir." "Did you ever observe them behaving as a married couple?" "No, sir. Never even a hand held." There was silence. Then Mr. Danvers rose for cross-examination. "Mr. Fry," he began, voice calm, "you worked at Graythorne House for how long?" 6 weeks, sir." "Which wing did you serve?" "The eastern. Upstairs." Danvers nodded. Then perhaps you can tell us something about the Duchess's rooms. Her rooms? Fry blinked. Yes, describe them if you would. I didn't go in, sir. You were assigned to her wing. Yes, but not her room directly. Then how do you know who entered or exited it? I heard things. From whom? No answer. Did you keep a journal? A record? No, sir. Do you recall the date of the alleged comment about her leaving? A pause. It was after supper, maybe the second week. Danvers turned to the judge. My lord, I'd like to present a letter, sealed and kept in my firm's custody, dated on the second week of the Duchess's arrival. It was written by the housekeeper of Graythorne House, Mrs. Hartley, and entrusted to us with explicit instructions to release it only should the marriage be legally contested. He held up the document. This letter contains an inventory of the Duchess's activities for that week, including her direct oversight of household finances, her presence at morning tea with the Duke, and her organization of estate duties, all verified by 3 members of staff. The judge leaned forward. Danvers opened the letter and read it aloud. Each line was a thread, weaving a tapestry of competence, presence, and legitimacy. When he finished, he folded it and returned to his seat. Fry shifted in the witness box, pale and silent. The judge turned to Hadrian's barrister. Do you wish to proceed? The man hesitated. No, my lord. Lord Erskine glanced once more at the bundle of documents before him. The court finds the petition to restructure the Graythorne estates valid and reasonable. The Duchess's role in managing and preserving the estate has been demonstrated with convincing thoroughness. The motion is accepted, pending a final financial audit to be conducted by court-appointed officials. A murmur rose from the gallery. Lady Pentlow exhaled. A merchant clapped once before thinking better of it. Hadrian Vale sat unmoving, but his jaw was tight. Honoria, seated just behind him, said nothing, but when she turned her face slightly, her eyes met Iris's, and for the first time she looked away. Outside the courtroom, the sky had cleared. Sunlight filtered through the London haze, pale but persistent. Iris stood on the steps, the wind tugging gently at her veil. Tristan approached her, glancing toward the street where the carriage waited. You did well, he said. She looked at him, not as an ally or a partner-in-law, but as a man. So did you. He extended his arm. She placed her hand upon it, her fingers curling softly into the wool of his sleeve. And together they descended the steps. Not with triumph, but with truth. A quiet, steady truth that would outlast scandal and shadow both. The wind was rising over the hills as twilight settled on Bath, turning the limestone facades the colour of old gold. Inside Graythorne House, the lamps flickered early, casting elongated shadows across the polished floors and oil portraits. A letter lay upon Iris's escritoire, folded once with deceptive neatness. No seal, no handwriting she recognized. Yet when she opened it, the words struck like a blade drawn quietly between her ribs. Upon final dissolution of entail, steps shall be taken to enact a private annulment on grounds of ducal prerogative. This arrangement ensures protection of all titles henceforth. The breath caught in her chest. For the briefest moment the pain returned. The hollow terror from the altar, the sense of being discarded before she had even begun. But then, as the candlelight danced across the ink, a line caught her attention. Ducal prerogative. Tristan never used such phrasing. He preferred plain, direct words. This was legalese, cold, impersonal, and unmistakably not his voice. Her fingers, steady now, folded the letter once more. A forgery, the final move of a desperate man. She knew who had authored it before even lifting her eyes from the page. She did not summon a carriage. Instead, cloaked in slate-blue wool and gloved in kid leather, she walked, past shuttered shops and whispering hedgerows, past the rustle of winter leaves and the hush of late-hour Bath. Her path led unerringly to the old abbey ruins, where stone arches still stood like the ribs of some ancient beast, solemn against the sky. Hadrian was waiting. He turned at the sound of her boots on gravel, a smile already in place, but it faltered when he saw her face. You received it, he said. Not a question. His tone was low, practiced. I thought it best you know what awaits you when the ink dries. Iris did not flinch. I recognized your solicitor's tone, not Tristan's. Hadrian took a step closer, his hands clasped behind his back, like a tutor scolding a recalcitrant pupil. You overestimate your position, cousin. This alliance was always transactional, a noble cause, a necessary fiction. Then it's fitting that you built your final lie on forged parchment, she replied coolly. Her breath formed clouds between them. You miscalculated. Again. His lips curled. You think Bath will side with a duchess whose father gambled away her dowry, whose marriage began in scandal and ends in legal trickery. My marriage has not ended, she said, her voice cutting through the dusk, but yours, to truth, to reputation, to even the thinnest veil of decency that has long since rotted. Behind a broken pillar, a sharp breath was drawn. Hadrian turned at the sound. From the shadows emerged two men, Thomas Lurie and Mr. Merton, the stonemason, both respected merchants in Bath. Beside them, Lady Pentlow descended the stone steps like judgment itself. You do enjoy theatrics, Hadrian, she said, her cane tapping against the stone, but you've chosen a poor stage. Hadrian's jaw worked, but no words came. We were here at Lady Iris's request, Pentlow continued, invited to see the Abbey restoration site. I imagine we weren't meant to hear your melodrama, but alas, we did. Hadrian looked to Iris with cold fury. You baited me. No, she said, her gaze unwavering. You betrayed yourself. Footsteps echoed from the far arch. Tristan emerged, his coat dark against the twilight, a stack of papers in his hand. He approached without hesitation, stopping beside Iris as if they had stood together for a lifetime. The groom who tampered with the cliff path, he said quietly, addressing Pentlow and the merchants, was paid from accounts tied to Hadrian's household. We traced it through two intermediaries. The steward fled this morning. A flicker of panic crossed Hadrian's eyes. You can't prove. We already have, Tristan said. He handed the documentation to Lady Pentlow, who flipped through the pages with the sharp efficiency of a magistrate's wife. Her silence spoke volumes. Hadrian turned to his sister then, the only ally he had left. Honoria, he said, this cannot stand. But Honoria stood immobile near the archway, her hands clenched at her sides. The perfection of her coiffure and fur-lined pelisse could not conceal the tremble in her voice. You went too far, she whispered. You always do. He reached for her arm. She stepped back. And in that quiet gesture, so small, so public, Bath society took its cue. Honoria Vale would not save her brother. Her silence was not loyalty, it was abdication. Iris turned to Tristan. Is there anything more to reveal? He met her eyes, tired and steady. Only that I never intended to dissolve this marriage. Not in law, not in heart. That night, Bath did not sleep. Word travelled faster than carriages. Pentlow had overheard. The merchants were telling the truth in the pump room by candlelight. Greythorn House had been attacked from within the family, and the Duchess had stood her ground without flinching. When the bells of St. Swithin's rang the next morning, it was not for scandal or ceremony. A rider in chancery livery dismounted at Greythorn's gates, frost clinging to his shoulders. He carried the decree in a velvet pouch, stamped and sealed. The entail was dissolved. The estates were secure. Hadrian Vale's petition was dismissed with costs. Tristan read the letter aloud in the parlour as the staff gathered in reverent silence. No toast was raised, no triumphant anthem played, and yet in the hush that followed, something shifted. The weight that had hung over the house since Iris crossed its threshold was gone. She felt it in the way Mrs. Kettering smiled without caution, in how the footman held his spine straighter when he passed the door, in how Tristan turned to her, not as if she were part of the solution, but as if she were home. That evening, while the sky turned lavender over the abbey stones, Iris walked again to the ruins, not to confront, not to plead, but to simply stand. She looked upon the arches not as broken things, but as frames through which light passed, redefined. And there, standing beside her, Tristan offered no grand speech, just a gloved hand held out. She took it, not for alliance, not for duty, for something truer. And as snow began to fall in thin silver threads, Iris Carrow Graythorne, once a bride felled by a word, stood unshaken, her name no longer a question, but a legacy chosen. The first flakes of snow clung to the Abbey's ancient stones like pearls on worn velvet. Graythorne Abbey, once shuttered and silent, now stirred with gentle life. A modest placard had been hung at the gates, written in Iris's own hand, announcing its new purpose: open to the public on select days, with a restoration fund established for tenant repairs and local needs. There were no grand proclamations, no indulgent dedications, only clarity, order, and quiet dignity, the hallmarks of the woman who had resurrected a legacy. Inside Graythorne House, the change was palpable. Where silence had once held dominion, now came music, laughter, and the rustle of preparations. Candles flickered along the staircases, garlands of pine and holly draped across banisters, and the faint scent of orange peels and cloves perfumed the air. It was the first Christmas gathering held in years, and no one, not footman nor guest, seemed to move without wonder in their step. Iris moved through it all like a conductor through a symphony, never intrusive, always aware. The invitations had gone out not to society ladies or titled neighbours, but to the heart of the estate, widows, tenant farmers, merchants, and musicians who once played in cold silence beneath the eaves of the lawn. They came in carriages and carts, wrapped in borrowed furs and patched coats, their eyes wide as they stepped into the marble foyer warmed by firelight and welcome. Lady Pentlow arrived with her usual grace, noting aloud that she had not visited Graythorne in nearly a decade. "It appears the Duchess has given the walls back their voice," she murmured to a passing servant, who nodded with quiet pride. In the drawing-room, soft music bloomed beneath the crystal chandelier. The same quartet who had once practiced unseen now played openly for a room of rapt guests. Iris had placed no restrictions on them. They chose folk ballads, carols from tenant families, and a hymn sung by a girl of no more than 9 years that hushed the room to stillness. Tristan, standing near the hearth, watched it all unfold with the quiet astonishment of a man who had forgotten what belonging felt like. His face bore no mask that evening. The pain that had once held his brow taut had receded. In its place lived something softer, a serenity forged not in ease, but in the hard-won knowledge of what it meant to be rebuilt. He spoke briefly as supper was served, raising a glass of claret and thanking the guests for their presence, their patience, and their unwavering faith in the house they now called home. When he turned to Iris, his voice dipped lower, but the room heard. "And to the lady who restored not only stone and ledger, but warmth and direction to a house that had neither, my deepest thanks." Some wept. Others smiled behind their napkins. Lady Pentlow merely nodded, as though a prophecy had been fulfilled. In the days that followed, Bath delivered its verdict, not in scandal sheets, but in silences. Lady Honoria Vale found her social calendar strangely light. Her callers dwindled. Invitations that once arrived on monogrammed paper now arrived not at all. A brief announcement appeared in the Bath Chronicle, written in elegant but anonymous tones. Lady Honoria Vale to winter with relations in the north. No disgrace, no exile. Just a polite disappearance, the kind that left no ash, only absence. Iris never spoke of her sister-in-law's retreat. She merely ensured that the tenants of Honoria's dowry lands received the same winter repairs as the others. As January drew near, the snow deepened, wrapping Graythorne in quiet splendour. The staff moved with practised cheer. The stables were full of laughter from the new apprentices, and the small chapel on the western edge of the property hosted its first community gathering since the days of Tristan's grandfather. On the eve of Twelfth Night, Tristan found Iris in the winter garden, where lanterns hung from bare-limbed trees and frost shimmered on stone benches. She wore no jewels, only a simple velvet cloak and gloves lined in lamb's wool. Her breath misted as she turned to him. He did not bring diamonds, nor silks, nor any heirloom token, only a piece of parchment folded into quarters, the ink still fresh. She took it in silence and read, "This house is yours, as are its records and revenues. What I built alone means nothing unless shared with the woman who restored its soul. I offer not riches, but ordinariness, a garden to tend, days to rise to, quarrels to resolve, and silences to share. When she looked up, his gaze did not waver. "You were felled by a word," he said quietly. "Let me offer a better one." She stepped closer, her gloved hand finding his. "Only if that word is every day," she whispered. Snow began to fall again, soft as memory. They stood together in the garden where so much had broken and healed. The word that had once undone her, annulment, now belonged only to the past, to a law rewritten, a ghost banished. What remained was not spectacle. It was love, hard won, faithfully kept, a home brought back to life. The bells of Bath rang softer now, their echoes tempered by time and the slow, inevitable shifting of the world. But on the edge of the Greythorn estate, where winter crocuses bloomed early among the ruins of the old abbey, life stirred in quiet beauty. It had been 8 years since the day the Chancery decree arrived with frost on its seal. 8 years since a woman in borrowed lace chose dignity over fear, and a man encased in grief dared to live again. Greythorn House had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The marble floors remained polished, the books in the library still carried the scent of parchment and oak, but the soul of the place had transformed. There was music, daily, not reserved for fetes or holidays. Children's laughter echoed down the corridors, chased by the sound of slippered feet and the occasional reprimanding bark of a faithful spaniel named Ashby. Iris Greythorn sat in the south garden beneath a pergola woven with flowering vines. Her hair was longer now, streaked with the faintest silver at the temples, though her eyes had lost none of their steady warmth. On her lap rested a ledger, but it was not one of estate accounts. It was a journal of memories, handwritten and bound in leather by her husband. "Don't let this life slip by undocumented," he had said years earlier, placing it in her hands with the quiet reverence of a man offering a crown. Now it held everything. The names of tenants who came and went, births on the estate, letters of thanks from widows, and ink-pressed flowers from the first harvest fair their son had toddled through, face covered in jam and wonder. Yes, their son. Thomas Tristan Greythorn, now 7, rode his pony across the lower green under the watchful eye of a groom and a very serious 8-year-old cousin, Annabel Vale, whose mother had once been the proudest woman in Bath. Honoria's fall had not been dramatic, but it had been decisive. After the Chancery ruling and her brother's disgrace, she had left for Yorkshire and never returned. No scandal tainted her directly, but society had closed its doors with genteel finality. Her daughter, Annabel, had been sent to Greythorn at 5, ostensibly for a season of gentler air, but in truth because Honoria had realized that Iris, whom she once scorned, was the only one left who would raise the child with tenderness, not ambition. Iris never spoke ill of her sister-in-law, but when she tucked Annabel into bed each night, she whispered stories of courage, kindness, and the strength of being true to oneself. And the girl listened. As for Tristan, he had aged into peace, into fullness. He remained tall and broad-shouldered, his once solemn features now etched with laughter lines. The pain that had once haunted his silences had been replaced by purpose. He worked beside Iris on the estate and spent hours restoring books in the library he once couldn't bear to enter. On Sundays, he walked with Thomas to the old abbey ruins and told him tales of those who came before. Every summer, on the anniversary of their wedding, he placed a single white rose at the base of Eliza's portrait, which now hung not in the main hall, but in the quiet upper corridor reserved for memory and prayer. And every year, Iris left a violet beside it. Their love had not burned with the heat of scandal or the rush of passion. It had deepened. Like roots through stone, it had weathered seasons, doubts, and whispered rumors. It had grown not in shadows, but in sunlight, slow, patient, and unshakable. Society, for its part, had changed in its own way. The Greythorn reforms became a model studied in other counties. Widows were no longer dismissed as charity cases, but recognized as keepers of community memory. The word Duchess no longer summoned only jewels and carriages, but stewardship, integrity, and strength in the face of scorn. On this crisp spring morning, Tristan appeared beside Iris without a sound. He had that gift of stillness, though she always felt him before she saw him. "Thomas says he wants to be a carpenter," he said, handing her a cup of tea. "Or a lion tamer. Possibly both." She smiled, accepting the cup. "I'd prefer the carpenter. Less roaring." He sat beside her, their shoulders touching, their silence companionable. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Any of it?" She looked at him then, truly looked, at the man who had once whispered annulment, and now whispered always. "No," she said, her voice low with the weight of years. "We built something real, and real things endure." He nodded and reached into his coat, producing a small bundle, linen-wrapped and warm. Inside lay a necklace, a single gold pendant, shaped like a key. "The key to the winter garden," he said, "so you never forget that you opened it." Her throat tightened, and she held the gift in trembling fingers. The garden had been their turning point. It still stood, lantern-lit and tender in every season. As they sat beneath the vines, the estate around them moved as it always had. Labourers tending fields, music spilling from the schoolhouse, a dog barking in the distance. But for a moment, time held its breath. Iris leaned into Tristan's shoulder, her hand finding his. In the winter of their beginning, one word had shattered her. Now, in the spring of their legacy, only love remained. Some stories are born from scandal, others from survival, but the most powerful are born from the quiet, courageous choice to love, anyway. Iris and Tristan's journey was never about grand declarations or perfect beginnings. It was about weathering storms side by side, about healing from old wounds with gentle hands, about turning a house of silence into a home full of laughter. In a world that often measures worth in wealth or titles, this story reminds us that dignity, kindness, and resilience are far more enduring. That sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stay. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of Iris's fear, or the slow thaw of Tristan's grief, leave a comment below and tell us what touched you most. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word annulment in the comments. It's a quiet tribute to the kind of love that lasts, not because it's easy, but because it's true. We pour heart and soul into these stories so you can escape into another time, another heartbeat. If you'd like to support our work, you can send us super thanks with whatever amount feels right to you. It helps us keep creating tales that stir the soul. And if supporting financially isn't possible right now, know that just sharing this video with a friend or loved one makes a world of difference. Love, after all, is meant to be passed on. Be sure to check the cards we've left at the end of this video. There you'll find more emotional, dramatic historical romances, each one crafted with the same care and depth. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the love that saves us doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with a hand held steady and the courage to begin again.